Chapter 1. St. Aldhelm's village was the sort of place where even the church bells rang politely, never interrupting tea time or nap time if they could help it. A thin mist had clung to the hedgerows all morning, the sort that never quite turned into rain, but made lace curtains look permanently damp. Yet by 2 o'clock, the sun made a respectable showing through the haze, just in time for the annual Rose Lane Garden Club luncheon. The gathering was held, as always, in the conservatory of Mrs. Prudence Lyle, a widow of excellent standing and formidable china. Her prize-winning delphiniums framed the glass walls like a cathedral, while her lemon-drizzle cake had already inspired both reverence and rivalry among the other ladies. Miss Marple sat in the corner beside the begonias, quietly stirring her tea. She wore her usual dove-grey cardigan and a hat that had once been mauve, but was now something more akin to polite resignation. She smiled faintly as Mrs. Lyle recounted, for the 4th time, how her begonias had taken to the new soil like ducks to water. But Miss Marple was not, in truth, listening to the begonias. Her eyes moved gently over the gathering, taking in the flicker of glances and the way one hand hesitated too long over a cup. At the centre of the room stood Letitia Blackwell, a newcomer to the village, with auburn hair too perfect for her age, and the sort of pearls that whispered inheritance. She laughed too freely, and poured tea with too much ceremony. Yet it was the way she kept glancing toward the far end of the conservatory, toward the heavy floral curtain drawn across the side door, that made Miss Marple's eyes narrow, just slightly. Of course, Letitia was saying now, one mustn't trust village gossip, so terribly poisonous. The comment seemed general enough, but it earned a sharp glance from Eleanor Hargreaves, seated 2 chairs away. Eleanor, a retired schoolmistress, had never married and wore her disapproval like a brooch. "I wouldn't say gossip," Eleanor replied crisply, "is any worse than, shall we say, flirtation with married men." An audible hush fell between the teacups. Mrs. Lyle coughed into her napkin, and someone dropped a spoon. Letitia gave a practised laugh. "Oh, I do adore Eleanor's wit. It's practically criminal." Miss Marple's eyes rested a moment on Eleanor's fingers, white-knuckled around the rim of her cup, then on Letitia's, which had trembled for a second before settling too, precisely into her lap. Across the room, Reverend Mayhew chuckled awkwardly. Ladies, let us not allow tea to steep into treason. Who's for another slice?" But the tension had already taken root. It hung in the conservatory like the scent of overripe roses. Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed her gaze to drift toward the curtain. It was thick damask, patterned with chrysanthemums, and drawn across a seldom-used back entrance that led down a short stone path into the garden. A curious thing, she thought, to keep closed on such a lovely day. Just then, a low voice broke her thoughts. "I suppose she'll be found out sooner or later," whispered Minnie Prowse, a local seamstress with more curiosity than discretion. She was speaking to the woman beside her, Agnes Tomlin, the grocer's wife, who nodded, eyes wide. Miss Marple, without appearing to eavesdrop, adjusted her teacup slightly closer to them. But their voices had dropped again, and the moment passed. Later, when the luncheon wound down, Letitia offered a toast, an odd thing to do at a garden club meeting, and spoke vaguely of new beginnings and letting go of the past. No one clapped, but everyone smiled. In villages like St. Aldhelm's, silence had its own kind of applause. As the ladies filtered out through the conservatory doors, Miss Marple remained seated, watching as Letitia stepped toward the drawn curtain, then paused. She looked over her shoulder just once, before continuing on toward the front of the house. A few minutes passed before Miss Marple rose. She adjusted her gloves, then wandered slowly toward the curtained door. Her fingers brushed the edge of the fabric. A faint draught stirred from behind it, and something else. Beneath the hem of the curtain, barely visible against the pale stone floor, were footprints, damp ones. A line of small dark smudges trailed in from the garden, one booted, the other oddly flat, and disappeared behind the curtain, as though someone had slipped inside during the luncheon. Miss Marple did not lift the fabric. She merely looked at the prints a moment longer, then turned and made her way toward the front steps. The birds were still singing. The roses were still in bloom, but something unpleasant had already crossed the threshold of Mrs. Lyle's tidy conservatory. Something that would not go unnoticed for long. Before moving next, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments, and if you crave more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2, Morning arrived in St. Aldhelm's, with the hum of bees, the clink of milk bottles, and the faint rustle of curtains, being drawn back by cautious hands. Gossip moved quicker than the sun, and by breakfast time, 3 households had already discussed what Letitia Blackwell wore to the luncheon. 2 had speculated on her insincere toasts, and 1, Mrs. Booker at the post office, had declared her altogether too modern. At the edge of the village, Miss Marple stirred a teaspoon of marmalade into her tea. She sat by the window, eyes flicking over the quiet lane below. Her knitting needles rested on her lap, untouched. She had already gone over the footprints in her mind several times, each smudge, each strange shape. Not footprints tracked from inside going out, but the opposite. Someone had entered the conservatory while the gathering was already underway, and not from the front, but to what end? The ring of the telephone startled the room. She rose and answered with her usual gentle, "Good morning, Jane Marple speaking." "Jane?" "It's Prudence. Do forgive the hour. I thought you should hear it from me." Mrs. Lyle's voice trembled beneath its usual composure. "There's been a situation," she continued, "at my house. The police are here." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. She waited. One of the constables found the curtain drawn aside this morning. I hadn't touched it, you see. And then, well, behind it, her breath caught. There was a body in the flower bed, Jane, just beyond the side path, hidden in the lilacs. Miss Marple's fingers closed gently around the receiver. "Who was it, dear?" "That new woman, Letitia Blackwell." There was a long silence on both ends. "She'd been there all night, they say. Poor thing. Murder, they think. Someone struck her head. There was blood on the bricks." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the edge of her teacup. "I'm so sorry. Prudence," she said at last. "Shall I come?" "Oh, yes, yes, please do." Miss Marple arrived 20 minutes later, quietly and without fuss. The Lyle house had been overtaken, though tastefully so, by the local constable and his sergeant, who wore a permanent look of someone trying to remember the last time he handled something more serious than a missing hedgehog. Detective Sergeant Colin Weatherby was young, overly polite and already flustered. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod that tried to balance authority and embarrassment. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I understand you were present at the luncheon yesterday." "Yes," she said simply, "as were most of the ladies in the village." Hish cleared his throat. "Of course, you may be aware that Mrs. Blackwell was found deceased just past the curtain there." He gestured vaguely toward the conservatory. "I am," Miss Martle said gently. "Prudence told me. A terrible business." Weatherby shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, we're not jumping to conclusions, naturally. Could have been an accident, although the angle of the injury, it suggests otherwise." Miss Martle offered a nod, her gaze already drifting past him. Mrs. Lyle stood near the French doors, wrapped in a lavender shawl, her lips drawn tightly. She was speaking to another figure Miss Marple hadn't expected, Reverend Mayhew. "Of course we'll say a prayer," he was murmuring. "But do let the police finish, Prudence. No one even heard anything," Mrs. Lyle said in a hoarse whisper. "How is that possible? My garden is not the sort of place for murder." Miss Marple moved past the constable with a soft, "May I?" and stepped into the conservatory. The curtain still hung slightly ajar, letting in a cool breeze from the path beyond. She did not approach the lilacs. That part was cordoned off. Instead, she knelt beside the curtain and examined the floor. The footprints had faded slightly, but they were still there, darker than yesterday, their trail now clearer. One booted, yes, but the other had no heel. A flat shoe. A slipper, perhaps, or someone with an uneven step. But more than that, something had changed. She tilted her head. There were now two trails. One led inward, from the garden to the curtain, as she had seen yesterday. The other led outward again, not perfectly aligned, but staggered, as if made in haste. Someone had entered during the luncheon, and left later, dragging something behind them. Miss Marple? The voice belonged to Constable Reed, an older man with more years in his shoes than cases on his desk. "Ma'am, I shouldn't let you. I'm merely observing the floor," she said with a pleasant smile, and noting that whoever did this tried very hard not to be seen. "But sometimes, you know, footprints tell stories, lips refuse to." He looked confused, but nodded anyway. Miss Marple stood. She turned toward the back of the house, where the kitchen door lay half open. A soft clang echoed from within, someone dropping a pan. "Who else was in the house yesterday?" she asked mildly. "Just Mrs. Lyle, a maid named Nora, and the caterers, though they left before the luncheon really began. Has anyone spoken to Nora this morning?" The constable shifted. "She left early. Apparently took ill. Mrs. Lyle said she seemed pale last night." Miss Marple didn't reply. Her gaze lingered on the kitchen door. From the corridor, the familiar shuffle of Eleanor Hargreaves' shoes echoed in, sharp, clicking, measured. "She's dead, then?" Eleanor asked, arms folded across her chest. "Not a surprise?" Miss Marple turned slightly. "Why do you say that?" Eleanor shrugged. "Women like her never last long. Too much attention, too many secrets." There was something bitter in the way she said it, and something careful in the way she didn't look at Mrs. Lyle. Miss Marple studied her a moment. Then she turned back toward the garden path. There were secrets here. Not just murder, but long-held grievances, half-spoken insults and gestures that lingered too long. She didn't know the truth yet, but it had left its footprints. Chapter 3. By midday, the sky had grown thick with low clouds, and the lilacs behind Mrs. Lyle's conservatory swayed gently in the wind, as if uneasy with what they'd witnessed. The crime scene remained cordoned off with discreet rote and quiet apologies. No one raised their voices. St. Aldhelm's was a village that whispered even its scandals. Detective Sergeant Weatherby stood on the back path, a notebook in one hand, his brow furrowed as though trying to wrestle the facts into something resembling a timeline. "So," he said to Miss Marple, who had quietly rejoined him by the conservatory door, "Letitia Blackwell was last seen alive around 4 o'clock. Yesterday." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "That would be accurate. She left the garden club luncheon shortly after delivering her toast. Several of us saw her walk towards the front of the house. But she never actually left the property," Weatherby muttered. "Found dead just a few feet away, hidden like a weed beneath a rose bush. It's baffling." He scratched something into his notebook and looked up. "You noticed footprints yesterday before the body was found. Why didn't you say anything?" "I wasn't entirely sure what they meant," Miss Marple said gently. "One learns, in village life, not to leap at conclusions too quickly. Still, I had intended to mention it this morning." Weatherby didn't seem particularly pleased, but he gave a reluctant nod. "And the footprints were already there during the luncheon?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, quite distinctly, which suggests she was already being followed, or perhaps watched. Weatherby paused, then snapped his notebook shut. "We've begun asking a few of the attendees to stay behind for brief interviews. Would you mind sitting in? Just to observe?" "I'd be delighted," she said. "Observing, after all, is something I do rather well." They moved inside to Mrs. Lyle's drawing room, where the scent of gardenias tried, unsuccessfully, to mask a lingering tension in the air. Mrs. Lyle herself sat stiffly on the edge of a fainting couch, clasping a handkerchief, but not using it. She had offered her home for the questioning, but the faint flicker in her eyes betrayed a wish that she hadn't. The first to be interviewed was Agnes Tomlin, the grocer's wife, and an eager participant in village happenings, particularly those that involved whispered speculation. She perched in an armchair, her gloves still on, her hat crooked as though hastily thrown on in defense. "Such a terrible thing," she began, shaking her head. "Letitia may have been, well, different. But murder in St. Aldhelm's? It's like something from a dreadful magazine." "Did you notice anything unusual yesterday?" Weatherby asked. "Any arguments, disagreements?" Agnes frowned. "No arguments, no. But there was something in the way Eleanor Hargreaves looked at Letitia. Sharp, if you understand me. Like one of her old school rulers." Miss Marple sat quietly nearby, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look at Agnes, just at her gloves, still on, even indoors, nervous. She had a way of drawing attention, Agnes continued. "Letitia, I mean. Not always good attention. A bit too fond of secrets, if you ask me. Made people uneasy." "Did you see her after the luncheon?" "No," Agnes replied. "She disappeared rather suddenly, I thought. But that was Letitia." always leaving things unfinished. Miss Marple glanced up. "Did you speak to her before she left?" Agnes hesitated, then shook her head. "Only in passing. I did hear her say something to the maid, though, Nora, just before she left the room. Something about a favour." "A favour?" Weatherby asked, alert now. Agnes shrugged. "That's all I caught." Nora looked surprised, maybe even a little upset. But then she hurried off, and I didn't think much of it. Miss Marple gave the faintest nod, as if tucking that into a private drawer. Next came Eleanor Hargreaves. She entered briskly, shoulders set, and took her seat with the dignity of a woman used to giving detentions rather than receiving questions. Her eyes darted to Mrs. Lyle, then to Miss Marple. "I'll save you the trouble," she said. "Yes, I disliked her. No, I didn't kill her." Weatherby blinked. "That's not exactly the process, ma'am." "She was a manipulator," Eleanor said flatly. "She made friends with lonely women, used flattery like currency, always extracting something. I suspect half the village has shared secrets they now regret." "Did you share any?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Eleanor didn't flinch. "No, I never liked her enough to be fooled." "Did you speak with her after? Her toast?" "No, she left in some haste, I believe." "But you did see her speaking with someone before she left?" Weatherby prompted. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Yes, Reverend Mayhew. Just a few words. He didn't seem pleased." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Weatherby made a note. By late afternoon, the interviews had ended. The Reverend had politely declined a formal question, citing grief and prayer. Nora, the maid, remained curiously absent. Miss Marple stepped back outside, alone now, and stood once more beside the curtain. The fabric swayed in the breeze. She lowered herself slowly and examined the footprints again. The booted prints, narrow, well-soled, were fading. But the flat impressions remained firm, leading back toward the house. And now she noticed something new. A heel mark, barely more than a crescent, near the edge of the door frame. Too small for Letitia, too sharp. Woman's heel, one used to precision. She straightened and looked back toward the conservatory. Tomorrow she would speak to Nora, but tonight she would think about Eleanor's words. She made friends with lonely women. Sometimes, in villages like St. Aldhelm's, friendship was a weapon. Chapter 4. By the next morning, word of Nora Blake's disappearance had spread faster than the bakery's warm scones. In a village where the only thing more sacred than Sunday service was routine, the fact that the Lyle household's maid had left without a word, no apron returned, no farewell, not even an excuse, was a quiet scandal that hummed beneath every conversation. Miss Marple took her walk a little earlier than usual, her cane clicking gently along the cobbled lane. She paused briefly at the greengrocer's, exchanged pleasantries at the post office, and by 9:30 found herself standing before the narrow cottage behind the butcher's shop, Nora Blake's residence. It was modest, its lace curtains drawn, and a pair of flower pots sat crookedly on the window-sill. No sound came from within. Miss Marple didn't knock. Instead, she walked around the back, where a slatted fence separated the garden from a narrow alley. The back gate was slightly ajar. A thin trail of scuffed mud led away from the door, drying into the grass. She knelt carefully, more to examine the trail than from any belief it would still be fresh. One set of footprints, small, light, hurrying. She straightened slowly, brushing a leaf from her sleeve. Just then, a voice behind her said, "Looking for Nora, are you?" It was Martha Finch, the midwife, peering out from her kitchen window with a mug in hand. "I heard her leave," Martha said. "Early, still dark. Must have been 5 at most. Saw her from the window." "Did she say anything?" Miss Marple asked. "Only waved. Looked pale. Wore her Sunday coat. That navy one with the loose hem." Miss Marple nodded. "Was she carrying anything?" "A satchel. Nothing else I could see. She was in a hurry." "Did she seem frightened?" Hesitated. "Frightened or ashamed? Couldn't say which." Miss Marple offered a quiet thank you and resumed her walk. A short stop at the telephone exchange yielded confirmation. Nora had not returned to her sister's house in Lower Hanley, nor her sister's house in Lower Hanley, nor had she taken the usual morning train. She had vanished, neatly, swiftly, and without delay. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple stood before her writing desk and removed a small notebook. She turned past a dozen pages, each filled with quiet, meticulous observations, and stopped at one marked Nora Blake. Seen speaking to Letitia. Favor mentioned. Left house without informing employer. Footsteps at curtain. Flat soled, feminine. Possibly hers. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Lyle. She looked thinner somehow, her lavender shawl hanging looser at the shoulders. "Jane," she said, stepping inside without waiting. "The police think Nora's gone because she's guilty." Miss Marple offered her a seat, then quietly poured a cup of tea. "And what do you think, Prudence?" Mrs. Lyle accepted the tea, but didn't drink. "Nora isn't clever enough to plan a murder. She's a sweet girl. Nervous, yes, but not a killer." "Did Letitia speak to her yesterday?" "I believe so. Briefly. Something about a note." "A note?" "Yes. Nora said Miss Blackwell had given her an envelope and asked her to pass it on discreetly. Said it was for Reverend Mayhew." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did she pass it on?" "She tried, but the Reverend left quickly after the luncheon. I don't believe he received it." Miss Marple set her cup down. "Did Nora still have the letter when she left the house?" Mrs. Lyle frowned, trying to recall. "She said she'd kept it in her apron pocket, but her aprons were all still in the laundry this morning." Miss Marple rose. "Might I see Nora's room?" Mrs. Lyle hesitated, then nodded. Nora's bedroom was small and spare. A narrow bed, a single chest of drawers, and a bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks. Miss Marple scanned the room, then knelt beside the chest. Second drawer, handkerchiefs, folded neatly. Third drawer, a rolled apron, navy blue, slightly stained, and a sheet of notepaper wedged beneath it. Miss Marple pulled it free. The page was blank, but when she turned it to the light, faint indentations came into view. Someone had written on the sheet above it and pressed hard. She took a pencil from her handbag and shaded the surface gently. Words emerged. Not many, but enough. "He knows, must act before she speaks. Garden." Miss Marple stared at the message. No signature, but enough to suggest a hurried note. Perhaps Letitia's, perhaps not, and not addressed to Nora. No, this had been discarded. Carelessly, a thought struck her. She stepped to the fireplace. The ashtray nearby still held charred fragments. Among them, a piece of scorched paper with part of a letterhead still visible, St. Aldhelm's Parish Office. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage. She waited patiently on the stone steps as a parish assistant fetched the Reverend. Reverend Mayhew appeared in shirt-sleeves, eyes red-rimmed and fatigued. "I do apologize, Miss Marple. It's been—" "Yes," she said softly, "a dreadful time. I won't keep you long." He nodded, ushering her inside. "I understand," she began, "that Letitia Blackwell attempted to give you a letter yesterday. Did you ever receive it?" His pause was long, calculated. No, I did not." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Strange, that. I believe she entrusted it to your maid, but the envelope never reached you." He shifted. "Then I can't account for it." Miss Marple studied him for a moment. "Letitia had a way of learning things people preferred stayed hidden, and she sometimes put things in writing." The Reverend's lips thinned. "I assume," Miss Marple said lightly, "that if she knew something you didn't wish to be known, that would be most unfortunate." "I think you should leave, Miss Marple." She stood. "Of course. I always find in these matters that silence says more than confession." Outside, the wind stirred the branches overhead. Miss Marple walked home, the letter's indentations etched firmly in her mind. He knows. Must act before she speaks. Garden. But who was he? And who had the most to lose if Letitia spoke? Chapter 5. The vicarage windows remained shuttered well into the morning, a rare occurrence that did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Harbottle, who had delivered the parish bread every Thursday without fail since the coronation. She stood at the gate, squinting up at the front windows as if they might answer for themselves. "He's not taken ill, I hope," she murmured to no one in particular. By 10:30, word had reached 3 different households that Reverend Mayhew had refused visitors and cancelled that evening's scripture discussion, an act many quietly regarded as bordering on scandal. Miss Marple sat near her sitting-room window, carefully rereading the indented message she had rubbed into clarity the day before. "He knows, must act before she speaks." Garden. She had not yet shared it with the police, not because she distrusted them. Sergeant Weatherby was earnest, if unimaginative, but because timing mattered. In villages like St. Aldhelm's, truth often arrived in whispers, not shouts. She set the page aside and turned to the envelope she discovered with the parish letterhead fragment, retrieved from Nora's fireplace ashtray. The top corner had survived, marked with a faint smudge of violet ink. Letitia's fountain pen had produced that exact colour during the garden club's sign-in. Not definitive, but suggestive. By 11, Miss Marple set out towards the church grounds. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and beeswax, the sort of scent that clung to hymn books and secrets. The Reverend was in the vestry when she arrived, speaking softly with his assistant. He did not look surprised to see her, only tired, as though holding a door closed against a tide. "I came to return a prayer booklet," she said mildly. "Of course," he replied, stepping aside. She handed over a small leather-bound volume. "Entirely," blank, save for a single pressed violet petal tucked within the pages. His eyes caught the petal, then flicked to hers. "You believe I'm hiding something?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that you were the intended recipient of Letitia Blackwell's final message. And I believe you know why." He closed the vestry door behind her, his voice quieter now. He closed the vestry door behind her, his voice quieter now. She was going to ruin someone, he said. Perhaps several. I don't believe she cared any more. "Did she threaten you?" "No," he said, almost too quickly. "But she hinted. She always hinted. A name in passing, a knowing look." "And you?" "I may have written something indiscreet, years ago, to someone I never expected to see again." Miss Marple did not speak, and so he continued. "She found the letter. Said she stumbled across it in an auctioned lot of old correspondence. I never even knew it had left my study. But she brought it to the church. Said she thought I might want to see it before anyone else did." "And did you?" "I read it. I burned it." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "I'm not proud," he added, "but I had no part in her death. She meant to shame me, perhaps, but I'd have endured it." Silence fell. Only the slow tick of the vestry's wall clock filled the space between them. "Did anyone else see the letter?" she asked. "I don't think so." "Did you tell anyone she had it?" "No." "But someone may have followed her. She was not subtle." Miss Marple stood. "You might consider speaking to Sergeant Weatherby." He gave a thin smile. "And tell him what? That I feared embarrassment and destroyed evidence? That I panicked?" She touched the side of the door. "Even shame can be a motive, and others may assume it is yours. Best you clarify the truth before someone else does." That afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the bookshop on the green, ostensibly for a new needlework magazine, but more precisely to see Sybil Cartwright, the village's most insatiable observer. Sybil didn't disappoint. "Do you know what I heard?" she whispered across the counter. "The Reverend and Letitia had a row the week before she died. Right there, on the church steps." She handed him a letter. He looked white as chalk. "And who saw this?" Miss Marple asked, feigning mild interest. "Albert Gilly. He was trimming the hedges at the churchyard. Told me he thought she slapped the envelope right against his chest." "A letter," Miss Marple repeated. "Or a threat?" "Does it matter, dear?" Sybil said with a wink. "In St. Aldhelm's, they're often the same thing." Miss Marple purchased her magazine and returned to her cottage, where the fire had died to soft coals, and the shadows had begun to lean longer across the rug. She set the magazine aside, lit the lamp, and retrieved her notebook once more. "Reverend Mayhew confirms existence of letter, claims to have burned it. Motive: potential public shame. Denies involvement. Sybil: witness account via Albert. Public confrontation with Letitia, and beneath it, a new line. Letitia was handing out leverage, but someone took it from her before it could be used." She paused. Something still didn't sit right. If the letter had been a weapon, why deliver it at the luncheon? Why wait? Unless... Miss Marple glanced again at the fragment in her possession. Unless there had been more than one letter. One for the vicar, and another yet unaccounted for. She closed the notebook, her mind already sorting through conversations, glances, and moments overlooked. Somewhere in those threads was the name Letitia had not managed to speak. But she had tried, and footprints had followed her through the garden curtain, not just to kill, perhaps, but to silence. Chapter 6. Rain began just after sunrise, light at first, then steady. It pattered against the windows of St. Aldhelm's with a quiet insistence, softening the edges of the village until everything seemed slightly out of focus. It was the sort of rain that blurred secrets rather than washed them away. At the spindle tea room, Agnes Tomlin dabbed a napkin at the corner of her cup and leaned in toward her companion, Mabel Flint, lowering her voice out of sheer habit. "I only came for a bun," she murmured. "And what do I find but Reverend Mayhew's assistant, rooting through the bins behind the parish office, with gloves on?" Mabel's eyebrows lifted. "You're certain?" "Saw it myself through the kitchen shutters. And then, would you believe, he left with a small bundle tucked under his coat." "Perhaps it was old records," Mabel suggested, "or perhaps something more recent," Agnes said, pleased by the dramatic pause she allowed to settle between them. By midday, the story had twisted into 3 variations, one involving blackmail, one suggesting embezzlement, and the last linking the bundle to Letitia Blackwell's final moments. But none of the versions reached Miss Marple. Not yet. At 1:45, Sergeant Weatherby knocked at Miss Marple's door. She welcomed him in, offered him tea, which he declined, and waited with folded hands as he stood awkwardly near the hearth. "We've had something turn up," he began, "at the vicarage, of all places." "Not another letter?" she asked mildly. His eyebrows rose. "You knew about the first?" "I suspected. I'm afraid I often do." He cleared his throat. "This one was unopened. Found it behind a parish office desk, fallen between a cabinet and the wall, still sealed. Addressed to Lady Margaret Dinwoodie." Miss Marple didn't respond at first. Then, "Interesting. Do you know her?" "I've met her. She moved to the village just last year. Quiet. Wears hats too large for her frame, and pretends not to be listening when gossip drifts her way. She's staying at Beechwood House, yes. Her sister's estate. She rarely ventures out. We like to deliver the letter in person," he continued. "Officially, of course. But if you'd care to accompany me—" Miss Marple's smile was faint but certain. "I'd be delighted." Lady Margaret Dinwoodie answered the door herself. Unexpected for someone with both wealth and arthritis. She blinked at Sergeant Weatherby's introduction, her hands pausing at the lapels of her cardigan. "A letter?" she repeated. He handed it over. The envelope bore Letitia Blackwell's handwriting. Loose, elegant, confident. A faint water stain discoloured the corner. Miss Marple watched Lady Margaret's hands tremble slightly as she opened it. There were only 3 lines inside. "Margaret, I know what happened. The past always walks behind us, no matter how quiet. Our shoes. We must talk soon. Talk soon." Lady Margaret sat down rather abruptly. "She knew," she murmured. "I suppose I should have expected that." "What exactly did she know, Lady Margaret?" Miss Marple asked softly. The woman looked up. Her expression was more resigned than afraid. "Something very old and very foolish. I don't believe it has anything to do with her murder. But someone might. Miss Marple said, and perhaps they acted accordingly. Margaret's eyes dropped to the letter again. It was a scandal once, not criminal, but scandalous enough. I was involved with a man, a married one. Letitia knew because she had been involved with him as well, long before me. She folded the letter with care. She never judged, but she had a way of reminding you, just enough to make you nervous. Did she threaten you recently? Weatherby asked. No, but she hinted she might speak of it to my sister. That's all. She enjoyed that, knowing people still had something to lose. Miss Marple nodded. Did you see her at the luncheon? I didn't attend. I haven't left the estate since Easter. My sister was unwell. Sergeant Weatherby made a note, but Miss Marple already sensed this letter, while intriguing, wasn't the one that had led to murder. Letitia Blackwell had written to multiple people, the vicar, Margaret Dinwoodie, perhaps others. Not all of them might have welcomed her insights, and not all would have left her warnings unanswered. Later that day, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour, the letter now safely sealed in a folder marked Relevant Correspondence. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still loomed like a held breath above the rooftops. She picked up her notebook again. Letter number 2, Margaret Dinwoodie. Contents: personal scandal, not criminal. Motive: embarrassment possible, but murder unlikely. Beneath it, she drew a new line and tapped the page with her pencil. Pattern forming. Letitia used secrets to retain power. Wrote multiple letters. Recipients not yet accounted for. No. She paused, then slowly underlined the initials she'd shaded faintly at the bottom of the notebook. A.T. Agnes Tomlin. Not because she had received a letter, but because she had heard something, or perhaps had been used as a messenger. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the overheard whisper at the garden club. Letitia said something to the maid about a favour. What if the favour involved delivering a letter? And what if Nora, not Letitia, had been carrying more than one? Had someone mistaken the messenger for the threat? That evening, as dusk settled like smoke across the village rooftops, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the rectory library. She wasn't there to speak. She was there to observe. The Reverend's assistant, Harold Linton, was seated at the desk, poring over a pile of correspondence. He didn't notice her in the hall. What she noticed was the corner of the envelope tucked under a blotter. Same violet ink. Same paper. Another letter. And Harold Linton wasn't reading it. He was copying it. Miss Marple retreated without a sound, the soft click of her shoes muffled by the corridor rug. So Letitia hadn't just delivered letters. She had hidden one. And someone now was trying to make sure it didn't resurface in its original form. Which begged the most important question of all. What was in the letter that needed rewriting? Chapter 7. Morning in St. Aldhelm's began with cautious optimism. The skies had cleared, but the mood remained low-slung and tense, like laundry on a line before a coming storm. Most villagers went about their routines a bit more quietly than usual, stepping around the subject of murder, as if afraid to wake it again. Miss Marple, however, had risen early. She sat with her notebook open on the writing desk, the memory of the previous evening still fresh in her mind. The blotter, the envelope, and Harold Linton bent over the desk with the sort of concentration not often associated with spiritual duties. She had seen just enough to know two things. The envelope on the desk matched Letitia Blackwell's writing, and the man copying it was not its original recipient. By 9:30, Miss Marple made her way back to the vicarage. The Reverend was not in, and the housekeeper informed her that Harold Linton was sorting old sermon notes in the rectory library. Miss Marple asked to be announced. When she entered the library, Linton rose quickly, nearly knocking over his inkwell. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting anyone this morning." "No one ever expects me," she said with a soft smile. "Yet I do tend to appear. I find that timing is everything." He attempted a smile, but didn't quite manage it. "How can I help?" "I was hoping to speak about Letitia Blackwell," she said, settling into the armchair across from his writing desk. "I understand she was fond of writing letters, some of them quite persuasive." He glanced toward the desk instinctively, then caught himself. "I wouldn't know. I didn't know her well." "She seems to have known many people well," Miss Martle replied. "Did she ever correspond with you?" "No," he said too quickly. "Not directly." "Indirectly, then." He looked down, then carefully straightened a stack of papers. "She left a letter addressed to me," he admitted finally. The Reverend intercepted it, said it was best left unread, that it could stir unnecessary damage. "Damage to whom?" Linton hesitated. "To the parish, to him, to myself. I was once involved in something." Miss Marple waited. She knew better than to prod too soon. "It was long ago," he continued. "I was fresh out of seminary. A woman in another village accused me of impropriety. Nothing ever proven. But Letitia knew of it somehow. She brought it up casually in conversation weeks ago, made it clear she could mention it again, more loudly. And now? Now she's dead." Miss Marple regarded him carefully. "Is the letter you're copying the one she left?" His eyes widened. I wasn't." "I didn't ask what you were doing," she said gently. "I asked what it was." He let out a shaky breath. "It was half burnt when I found it. Torn, but legible in parts. I thought if I rewrote it, filed it away, I could make sure the wrong people didn't find it first. And if someone came asking, looked up, I'd show them the cleaned version." Cleaned version. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You believed that erasing part of the past might prevent harm in the present. A very understandable instinct, but not always the wisest." He looked away. "Tell me," she continued, "what was in the original that frightened you?" "The handwriting, the clarity. She didn't accuse me directly, but she suggested that the truth about my past might explain something about another man's fall from grace. She tied it to the Reverend." Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "That's quite a leap." "She said he covered for someone once, a mistake that cost him his first post. She implied it was me." "And was it?" He didn't answer, but the silence was long and heavy. Miss Marple left soon after, but not before asking Harold Linton for a copy of the rewritten letter. He handed it to her with shaking fingers. At home, she compared the document to the shaded impression from the burnt sheet Nora had discarded. Two matched almost, but the copied version had removed one specific phrase. "The curtain is always drawn to hide what we think no one sees." Letitia's metaphor was not just poetic, it was precise. She had written about the curtain, Mrs. Lyle's curtain, before her death. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. She reached for her notebook again. Letitia knew someone had been using the garden door. She suspected surveillance or secret meetings, possibly blackmail, possibly affair. She wrote letters to expose truths, but someone feared what she'd reveal next. She was killed behind the curtain she referenced. The coincidence was too precise. Miss Marple drew a line between the names. Reverend Mayhew burned his letter. Confirmed Letitia knew something. Covered for Linton, guilt or fear. Motive, scandal. Harold Linton caught rewriting evidence. Letitia referenced his past. Then motive, exposure. Margaret Dinwoodie. Letter confirms Letitia's reach. Unlikely killer. Motive limited to embarrassment. Miss Marple tapped the pencil once, twice. Then she circled a name she had not yet examined closely. Mrs. Prudence Lyle, the house with the curtain, the only person besides Letitia who might have known what that garden path was used for, and whose maid, Nora, had vanished without explanation the morning after the murder. Miss Marple closed her notebook. It was time to speak to Mrs. Lyle again, but this time not about what she had seen, about what she had chosen not to. Chapter 8. Mrs. Prudence Lyle answered the door with her usual elegance. Hair perfectly pinned, brooch aligned with surgical precision. But Miss Marple noted the small things. The faint tremble in her fingers, the uneven breath as she stepped aside, and the fact that her pearls, always present, were conspicuously absent. "I was just about to put the kettle on," she said, with practiced brightness. "Won't you come in?" Miss Marple entered without comment, her eyes drifting not to the teacups waiting on the sideboard, but toward the conservatory beyond. The curtain still drawn tight across the rear door, like a stage left dormant after its tragedy. "I hope this isn't a bad time," Miss Marple said kindly. Mrs. Lyle waved the thought away, though her smile never quite reached her eyes. "It's always time for tea, isn't it? Even when there's nothing else left to do." They sat across from one another in the drawing-room. Miss Marple accepted her cup, but didn't drink. She waited until the porcelain settled on the saucer before she spoke again. "I've been thinking about the curtain." Mrs. Lyle's eyes flicked to the conservatory door. "Oh, it's just a curtain, dear." "I suppose most things are, until they aren't. Curtains hide things, sound, light, people." A pause, and secrets. Mrs. Lyle's lips pressed into a pale line. "You always kept it drawn during the luncheon," Miss Marple continued gently. "Though it was a beautiful day, I wondered why." "It's an old habit," Mrs. Lyle said too quickly. "I don't like the glare. But you have tinted windows on that side. The glare wouldn't have reached the tea table." Mrs. Lyle stood abruptly. "Is this a visit or an interrogation, Jane?" "A conversation," Miss Marple said calmly. "With someone who might be protecting more than sunlight." Mrs. Lyle turned away, one hand clutching the mantelpiece. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, quietly, "I saw something." Miss Marple waited. That morning, before anyone arrived, I was arranging the tea service. I stepped into the conservatory to polish the glass tray. That's when I saw her. Letitia, speaking to someone outside, just beyond the rose arch. Could you see who it was? No. only a silhouette. But they were arguing. It wasn't a pleasant exchange. Miss Marple rose slowly and walked towards the conservatory door. The curtain still hung in place, its edge unmoved. "Why didn't you tell the police?" Mrs. Lyle hesitated. "Because I realized who it might have been." "You recognized the voice?" "No, but the way Letitia stood, the angle of her head, she was trying to block someone else's view. She didn't want to be seen, even from inside." And later, when we all gathered, Harold Linton arrived late, flushed, unsettled. He claimed he'd been helping the caterers, but I checked. They left an hour before. Miss Marple nodded, absorbing the detail without judgment. "You believed he killed her?" "I believed she was about to reveal something damaging. And Harold, he's unstable, Jane. He frightens me a little." "Yet you said nothing." Mrs. Lyle turned, her voice low. "I've known too many women who paid dearly for speaking when it didn't suit men to listen." Miss Marple moved closer, her tone still soft. "But silence pays its own price." Another silence fell, deeper this time. "I didn't kill her," Mrs. Lyle said, not defensively, but with something that almost sounded like sorrow. "But you saw who did." Mrs. Lyle looked at her sharply. Miss Marple let that linger. "Or you know what Nora saw, and that's why she ran." Mrs. Lyle turned to the window, her fingers tightening on the lace curtain. "Nora came to me the next morning, early, before the body was found. She was pale, trembling. Said she'd heard voices behind the conservatory during the luncheon. Said someone pushed Letitia. Hard. But she didn't see the face. Only the shoes. One booted, one flat, as if mismatched." Miss Marple's breath caught. "Flat?" Mrs. Lyle nodded. "Like an indoor slipper." That matched the partial trail Miss Marple had seen by the curtain. Not Letitia's, not a man's either. Feminine. Intentional. She said the argument was about letters, that Letitia had threatened to send one more. And then a scuffle. Then silence. She didn't go to the police. She was frightened. She asked me what to do. "And what did you say?" "I told her to leave." Miss Marple blinked. "You helped her disappear?" "I gave her enough money for a train fare and told her not to return. I thought I was protecting her, but maybe I was protecting myself." She turned from the window, her voice quieter now. "I didn't want the police digging into who else had been meeting in that garden. I didn't want them to ask why the curtain was always closed." Miss Marple gave her a long, searching look. "Was it you who met Letitia that morning?" Mrs. Lyle closed her eyes. "No, but she did tell me about the letters. Said she'd written to 3 people. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. 3. The Reverend, Lady Margaret, and Eleanor Hargreaves. A silence stretched between them like fine thread pulled too tight. "She didn't tell me what the letters said," Mrs. Lyle whispered. "Only that one of them would undo the village." Miss Marple walked home slowly through the village lanes, her thoughts heavy with revelations. She knew now that the killer had worn mismatched shoes, that 3 letters had been sent, that Eleanor, so sharp, so tightly wound, had been the final recipient. But where was her letter? It had not surfaced, which meant one of 2 things. She never received it, or she did, and destroyed it before anyone else could read what Letitia wrote. Miss Marple stepped into her sitting room, rain beginning to fall again in soft, steady lines. There were no coincidences in St. Aldhelm's, only patterns waiting to be seen. Chapter 9. The windows at Elderbank Cottage were always immaculate. Eleanor Hargreaves cleaned them herself, twice weekly, regardless of weather or occasion. She polished the glass with vinegar and resolve, as though determined that no speck of dust or weakness be allowed to settle where she lived. And yet, this morning, the left-hand sash window sat open an inch. Unusual. Miss Marple paused just short of the gate, her eyes lingering on the gap. It was not warm enough for airing, nor was it Eleanor's habit to leave anything unattended. Even her rose bushes were pruned on a strict calendar. She stepped lightly through the gate, its iron latch closing behind her with a click. She didn't knock at the front. Instead, she followed the stone path around to the garden side, where the kitchen door was ajar. Eleanor's voice called from within, sharp and surprised. "Miss Marple, what on earth?" "Good morning, Eleanor," she said mildly, stepping into the warm, lavender-scented kitchen. "Your kitchen door was open. I was concerned." "I opened it not 10 minutes ago," Eleanor replied, frowning. It must have drifted, but she didn't look convinced, nor did she close it. Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I wondered if you might have a moment. Something has been troubling me." Eleanor poured tea with steady hands, but her tone was guarded. "If it's about Letitia Blackwell, I've said all I care to." "I thought you might say that, but you see, I've learned something new." Eleanor gave a tight smile. "Haven't you always?" Miss Marple let that settle before continuing. "Letitia sent 3 letters before her death. One to Reverend Mayhew, one to Lady Margaret Dinwoodie, and one to you." The china cup in Eleanor's hand trembled slightly against the saucer. "I received no such letter," she said crisply. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Odd. She told Mrs. Lyle she sent it, and she never missed details." "Then she was mistaken. Or it was intercepted. That hung in the air longer than either of them liked." Miss Marple sipped her tea and let the quiet stretch. Outside, the hedge clippers of the gardener from across the lane clicked rhythmically, each snip punctuating the silence. Finally, Eleanor said, "I do not see why Letitia would write to me. She had a knack for knowing things people would rather keep quiet." Eleanor bristled. "There's nothing she could have known that I'd care to keep secret. No old disputes, no shared confidences, no acquaintances in common." Eleanor hesitated a beat too long. "There was something," Miss Marple said gently. "You've been holding it in your hands like a lit match since the luncheon." Eleanor stood abruptly. "Excuse me." Miss Marple watched her move to the sideboard, where a stack of unopened letters lay beside a biscuit tin. Eleanor rifled through them unnecessarily, avoiding eye contact. "I suppose," she said finally, her voice tight, "that if Letitia had written something, I would have burned it. But you didn't." Eleanor turned. Miss Marple's voice was softer now. "You kept it, perhaps intending to destroy it later, but someone else found it first." Eleanor's eyes darted to the window. "I came here this morning because I noticed something," Miss Marple continued. "Your window, open for the first time in months, and this kitchen door, unlatched. You didn't open them both, Eleanor. A long silence. Then Eleanor sank into the nearest chair. Her voice cracked as she spoke. It was here. I kept it behind the sideboard drawer. I thought, if I destroyed it, someone might think I had something to hide. And now it's missing, not at once. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. May I ask what the letter said? Eleanor's voice was low. It said she knew what I'd done during the war, that I'd falsified a reference for a woman who wasn't qualified to serve as a nurse. It wasn't malicious. I simply thought the girl deserved a chance. But people died. A mistake during an evacuation. She panicked. She blamed you. She left. Letitia found her later, got the full story. She never threatened to expose me, not directly. But she wanted something in return. What did she want? She wanted a favor, a name. Someone I'd known from the same network of wartime volunteers. Someone I suspected of profiting from false identity papers. Miss Marple leaned forward. Did you give her that name? No, I refused. I told her to leave me out of it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the next day, she was dead. Eleanor closed her eyes. I didn't kill her. I swear it. I believe you, Miss Marple said quietly. But someone else may not have. She stood and crossed to the sideboard. There was a small gouge in the wood, barely visible beneath the drawer. A splintered edge. Did you try to open it this morning? Eleanor stood as well. It jammed. I thought it was the humidity. Miss Marple carefully reached under the drawer and pulled. A moment's resistance, then it slid free. The space behind it was empty. But the faint outline of a rectangle remained. A dust-free patch, the size of a folded letter. Someone had taken it, likely during the early morning. Likely through the window. Miss Marple looked out toward the lane, where shadows fell long against the hedge. She turned back to Eleanor. I suggest, my dear, that you make a list of anyone who knew about that letter, even accidentally. We're nearing the end now, and someone is beginning to clean up loose ends. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and lit the fire with a match and a sigh. She sat in her armchair, shawl over her shoulders, notebook open. Beside her, Eleanor's letter. Stolen. Contents known. Motive for someone attempting to erase their involvement. She tapped her pencil against the page. Letitia Blackwell threatened exposure, but never directly accused. Someone acted preemptively. 30 hit. Someone now knows their secret may yet resurface. She circled a name. Not Harold, not the Reverend. A quieter figure. A woman, and one who knew how to slip through open windows. Chapter 10. The next morning, St. Aldhelm stirred under a sky as pale as porcelain. The usual rhythms resumed. Carts rumbled along the lanes. Church bells marked the hour, and lace curtains shifted just slightly at every passing shadow. But beneath the calm, a tremor moved through the village. Unspoken. Taut. Miss Marple had already visited the post office, left a note at the vicarage, and returned to her parlour by the time the first whispers began. She sat at her desk now, calmly writing a short letter, not in her usual hand, but with careful imitation of Letitia Blackwell's sweeping script. It took her 3 attempts to match the pressure and rhythm of the loops. To whom it may concern. You thought the letter had vanished. It hasn't. I left a copy. I trust the wrong person won't be holding it when the truth is known. L. She folded it neatly and slipped it into a plain envelope. No name, no address, just intention. Then she walked it to the church notice board, where villagers often left parcels for quiet collection. She pinned it to the cork with a single brass tack. By noon, half the village would have seen it, and by sunset the right person would act. It was Agnes Tomlin who found the note first. She'd come to deliver a jar of pickled onions for the vicarage lunch, and, as always, couldn't resist pausing at the board. 5 minutes later, she'd told Mrs. Harbottle and Mabel Flint, and within an hour, every kettle in the village was humming over speculation. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat with a fresh pot of tea and a good view of the lane from her window. She wasn't watching the foot traffic. She was watching who wouldn't walk past at all. At precisely 3:10 p.m., Eleanor Hargreaves passed by, chin high, expression unreadable. She didn't stop, but she looked. That ruled her out. At 3:22, Harold Linton appeared near the bakery, hands buried in his coat pockets. He made a wide circle around the church, but never approached, noted. But it wasn't until just before 4 that Miss Marple saw what she'd been waiting for. A figure, female, slight, wrapped in a grey shawl, moving swiftly toward the church from the side path behind the grocer's. Nora Blake. Her steps were quiet but purposeful. She reached the board, scanned it, and carefully removed the pinned letter. Then she slipped it into her coat and disappeared back around the bakery corner, as though she'd never been there at all. Miss Marple rose, donned her coat, and followed. She found Nora in the rear garden of Beechwood House, pacing. It took only a soft Miss Blake for the girl to spin, startled. Her face was pale, her coat too large, and the envelope crumpled slightly in her trembling hand. "Miss Marple," she said, you shouldn't be here." "No more than you should," Miss Marple replied gently. "But here we are." Nora looked down. "I only wanted to read it, just to be sure." "Of what?" Nora hesitated. "That it wasn't what I thought." Miss Marple moved closer, her tone softening. "What did you think it would say?" Nora's eyes were wet now. "That I'd killed her, or that someone would say I had. But I didn't. I swear I didn't. I tried to help. She gave me letters, said they were important. I delivered 2, just like she asked, but the 3rd, I kept it. I didn't mean to. I was afraid." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and removed a folded paper. It was not the real letter, but it looked enough like one to make Nora freeze. "This one, perhaps," Miss Marple said. Nora's lips parted, then closed. "Tell me the truth," Miss Marple said, more gently now. "Letitia gave you 3 letters?" Nora nodded. "One to Reverend Mayhew, one to Lady Margaret, and one to Eleanor Hargreaves." Nora's eyes flinched. "I tried to give it to Miss Hargreaves, slipped it under her door before I changed my mind, and tried to take it back, but it was gone." "So you've came again this morning?" "Yes, but someone else had already been." Nora swallowed. "Yes, I saw the window open. I thought maybe Miss Hargreaves had destroyed it. But something felt wrong." Miss Marple took a slow breath. "And what did Letitia say to you when she gave you the letters?" "That I was brave," Nora whispered. that sometimes the past needs light, even if it burns. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, dusk had begun its slow descent across the village rooftops. She lit the fire, made a note in her journal, and poured herself a small brandy. Not a habit, but the day required something warming. Her thoughts gathered. Nora hadn't killed Letitia. She had carried the letters, delivered two, attempted a third. Someone had intercepted Eleanor's letter. Someone who feared what it contained. Someone who wore mismatched shoes, a boot and a slipper. Flat, practical. Someone unremarkable by design. Miss Marple leaned forward and circled a single name in her notebook. Not Linton, not Eleanor, Mrs. Lyle. She had protected Nora, hidden her. She had seen the confrontation, but lied about who had been there. She had drawn the curtain, and she had the access and the motive. Letitia had known about the garden meetings, i.e. the curtain, and the secrets passed quietly under her roof. And Mrs. Lyle had chosen silence once before. But Miss Marple had now ensured silence would no longer serve her to Chapter 11. It was a still afternoon, the kind that held its breath just long enough to suggest something was about to break. The wind had quieted, and even the birds seemed to pause in their usual chatter. St. Aldhelm's moved softly through the day, unaware that within the tidy walls of Mrs. Lyle's conservatory, something unseen was shifting. Miss Marple arrived, without ceremony, just after tea. The invitation had been hers to issue, though delicately worded. If it's not too much trouble, Prudence, I wondered if we might revisit the conservatory. There's something I've been trying to see properly, and I think the light's best just before dusk. Mrs. Lyle had agreed, of course. She always did. Now she stood by the long glass windows, hands clasped neatly in front of her. She wore grey again, soft and unremarkable. Her brooch today was a small plain circle. No pearls, the curtain was open. I've left it as it was, she said, without turning. It seemed easier somehow. Miss Marple stepped through the conservatory door and looked out onto the garden path. The lilac bushes had been trimmed recently. No sign remained of the flattened earth where Letitia's body had once been found. Only the faint smell of disturbed soil and something else, something floral and slightly bitter. Funny thing about gardens, Miss Marple said. They hold on to what's been buried longer than most people do. Mrs. Lyle offered a faint smile. They're good at pretending things haven't happened. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but not at hiding the truth. She turned to face Mrs. Lyle fully. You know why I asked to come, don't you? I suppose you want to ask again about what I saw. No, Miss Marple said. I believe you saw more than you admitted, and I think you've told yourself it was for Nora's sake. But the truth, I fear, was much closer to home. Mrs. Lyle's smile wavered. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Letitia had something on you. Not a scandal exactly, but something embarrassing, dangerous even. You kept the curtain drawn because you didn't want her seen entering or exiting through that door. She used it often. She said it was quicker than going round, Mrs. Lyle said quietly. Indeed, but she wasn't just visiting, was she? She was meeting others, quietly, including, I suspect, someone you had tried to keep out of sight. Perhaps a tenant, perhaps a gentleman, Perhaps even someone passing through. Mrs. Lyle's eyes dropped to the polished edge of the tea trolley. Miss Marple continued, "You knew Letitia wrote letters. You knew she had something she intended to say about you. I suspect you begged her not to. She wasn't cruel," Mrs. Lyle said suddenly. "She was calculating. She liked control. She liked watching people squirm. And she miscalculated how far someone would go to silence her." Mrs. Lyle looked up sharply. Miss Marple met her gaze. The footprints by the curtain. One booted, one flat. "You told Nora to run because you were afraid someone might remember your habit of wearing a slipper on your right foot in the garden. The bad ankle." Mrs. Lyle's lips parted, then closed again. "I'm not here to accuse you," Miss Marple said softly, "but I am here to ask why you hid her letter." "I didn't," Mrs. Lyle said too quickly. "She trusted you with secrets, and she expected something in return. Your silence, perhaps, or your loyalty." Mrs. Lyle exhaled. She said she'd never send it, but she wrote it anyway. "And you found it?" Mrs. Lyle's eyes were glassy now. "The morning after, in her bag. She left it by the side table. I didn't mean to look, but it was open." "What did it say?" Mrs. Lyle shook her head. "It said I'd allowed things to happen here, that I'd kept company with men who weren't appropriate, that I'd looked the other way, and that if I didn't help her expose someone else, someone worse, she'd make sure I took the fall instead." "And what did you do with it?" "I burned it." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, "You told Nora to run, but you also knew she'd kept a copy of something. You feared it was that letter, and you feared it might surface again." Mrs. Lyle sat down abruptly in the cane-backed chair by the conservatory table. "I didn't kill her," she said softly. "I wanted to. For a moment I did. I thought, just push her into the lilacs, let the garden swallow it. But I couldn't." Miss Marple sat opposite. "Then who did?" A long silence. Then Mrs. Lyle said, "I don't know, truly, but I believe someone thought I had." Miss Marple studied her. The lines around her mouth were deeper today. Her hands, usually so precise, rested slack in her lap. "I don't believe you killed her," Miss Marple said finally. "But I believe you know who might have." Mrs. Lyle blinked. "Think back," Miss Marple said gently, "to the day of the luncheon. Letitia was seen speaking to someone behind the curtain. You said you couldn't identify them." Mrs. Lyle swallowed. "That was true." "But someone had visited your garden before." Mrs. Lyle nodded slowly. "Yes, Eleanor." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. She'd come the day before, asked to speak privately, wanted to know if Letitia had mentioned her in any of the letters. I said I didn't know. She was afraid. She was furious. Was afraid. She was furious. "Furious enough to come back?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Lyle didn't answer. But she didn't deny it. Miss Marple stood. "I think tomorrow Eleanor Hargreaves may be due for a rather gentle question. Not about what she saw, but about where she was standing when she saw it." Mrs. Lyle stared out into the garden. The curtain moved slightly in the breeze. "Do you think," she said almost to herself, "that gardens can forgive?" "No," Miss Marple said quietly, "but they do forget. Eventually." That night Miss Marple sat at her desk, the case nearly closed in her mind. One piece remained. She retrieved her notebook and underlined a final thought. The killer didn't just fear Letitia's words. They feared the idea that someone like Letitia could remember, and tomorrow she would remind Eleanor Hargreaves of that very thing. Chapter 12. The sky over St. Aldhelm's that morning was mottled with grey, clouds thick like old wool, threatening rain that never quite came. The kind of weather that held everything in suspense. Miss Marple, however, felt no such hesitation. She walked to Elderbank Cottage with her usual careful steps, her gloves buttoned, her hat tilted precisely. There was nothing hurried about her approach. She had no need for it. The final piece was already in place. Eleanor Hargreaves answered the door with a strange smile. "I thought we might talk," Miss Marple said simply. Eleanor gestured her inside without question. They settled in the front room, where the fireplace had been recently lit, but gave off no warmth. "I won't offer tea," Eleanor said after a beat. "I don't think either of us wants to pretend this is a social call." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite right. Though I think you'll find I've come not to accuse, but to clarify." Eleanor said nothing. Miss Marple looked toward the window. "The day of the luncheon, you told us Letitia made enemies, that she collected secrets, that she was dangerous to people who had something to hide." "I did. You also said she spoke with Reverend Mayhew, that he didn't seem pleased." "That's true." Miss Marple's eyes returned to her. "But what you didn't mention was that you spoke with her too, in private, behind the conservatory curtain, just before she died." Eleanor stiffened. "That's not proven." "No, but it is remembered. Mrs. Lyle saw the shadow of someone with Letitia that day. A woman, not tall, wearing garden shoes, one of them flat." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "I'm suggesting you confronted her," Miss Marple said gently but firmly. "Perhaps not with the intention to kill, but with the fear that she had finally truly decided to expose you. Your wartime falsification, your past judgment. You thought she'd written it all down and sent it off." "She did write it down," Eleanor whispered. "She said so herself. She said she was tired of people thinking kindness was enough, that sometimes the past had to be reckoned with." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And so you panicked." "No," Eleanor snapped. "I didn't panic. I tried to take it from her, the letter. I wanted to read it, see if she'd actually written the name. She refused. She turned away. I grabbed her arm. She pulled back. She was shaking now. She stumbled. I didn't mean to. She hit her head on the stone base of the lilac pot. There was no scream, just a sound, like a dropped teacup. And then?" Miss Marple asked. "I froze for a long time, and then I dragged her behind the bush, hid the letter. I didn't even read it. I burned it the next day." "You wore mismatched shoes," Miss Marple said softly. Eleanor blinked at her. "You'd only meant to pop by briefly. You didn't want anyone to see you. So you came by the back, wearing your gardening slippers, and forgot to change them both. When you walked through the garden curtain, you left your prints behind." Eleanor's breath caught. "You knew all along?" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But I suspected when the third letter vanished, when Nora returned to find it missing, and when you lied about receiving anything at all." Eleanor covered her face with both hands. Miss Marple waited. Finally, Eleanor looked up. "You'll go to the police." Miss Marple stood. "I already have." Eleanor didn't move. "But I told them what I believe," Miss Marple added, "that it was a tragic scuffle, that Letitia's fall was not premeditated, but the cover-up afterward, that was, and it delayed justice." Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "Will they arrest me?" "I expect they'll question you thoroughly. Whether charges follow will depend on what they believe, and on your honesty." Eleanor's shoulders slumped. As Miss Marple reached the door, she paused. "There's one thing I hope you'll remember." Eleanor looked at her, hollow-eyed. "You didn't kill Letitia because of what she did. You killed her because of what you were afraid she might do. But fear of exposure is not the same as guilt. If you'd trusted anyone, even her, you might have been spared this ending." Eleanor didn't reply. Miss Marple let herself out. The village buzzed for a week. The police came. Eleanor was questioned quietly. She confessed to the scuffle and the panic, and the hiding of the body. The motive was deemed credible. No charges were filed for murder. But obstruction of justice remained on the table. The letters, too, remained missing. No one ever found the burned remnants of Letitia Blackwell's final truths. Perhaps that was her last revenge. Miss Marple sat in her garden one morning not long after, a cup of tea at her elbow and her knitting resting untouched on her lap. Nora Blake had returned timidly, and now worked part-time at the vicarage. Mrs. Lyle had reopened her conservatory. Eleanor Hargreaves stayed indoors most days, her blinds drawn, her world reduced to the edges of her own remorse. The garden bloomed, and the curtain, once drawn to hide secrets, now hung open, letting in the light. Miss Marple didn't believe justice always looked tidy, or dramatic or complete, but she believed in truth, uncovered gently, and in the footprints we leave behind, even when we believe we've stepped carefully. End of chapter 12. Final chapter, Miss Marple and the Footprints, Outside the Curtain. Complete.